thank you everyone for joining the session at Natural Start Alliance. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. If you feel like popping in a chat where you're at right now, where you're from, I'm in Spokane, Washington. And I'm going to introduce myself here in a moment, but I just want to get my screen share going so you can see my presentation. Northern Maine, Gunnison, Colorado. All right. Missouri, excellent. So this session is all about nature play for the seven senses. Excuse me, I can't see this behind all the little screens I have going. And how we can create natural play and learning spaces for all kids of all ages, abilities, and diversities. I'm Jenna Jockus. I'm a landscape architect and nature play expert. I've been doing this work for over 20 years now. And I design nature play spaces in all sorts of settings, sensory gardens, outdoor classrooms and learning landscapes. I've even done some indoor nature-based playscapes, super fun. But my specialty within this design specialty is designing for kids with neurodiversities, kids with autism, sensory processing disorders, ADHD. And what I found in those, 17 of those 21 years is that when we approach design and designing for kids with neurodiversities, it's actually really good design for kids of all abilities, all kids. I'm also a professional artist. That comes through in a lot of my work that you'll see. And to add to my street cred, I am a mom of 6-year-old twins. And you'll see my daughters in quite a few of these images here. They are my guinea pigs, but they're also my biggest critics. My company is N is for Nature Play. In addition to design through my company, I teach parents, educators, childcare professionals, and therapeutic professionals how to transform their children's spaces into sensory-rich nature play and learning spaces that benefit all kids. All right. So in today's discussion, I've got about a 45-minute presentation. I've got 10 to 15 minutes that end for Q&A. And if you have a question during any point along the way, just put it in the chat. And if I catch it and if it's a good time to address it, I sure will. But otherwise, we'll address questions at the end. But 3 main points today. We all know what nature play is, right? That's one of the reasons why we're here. But what does it mean when you create a nature play space for the 7 senses? And what does that mean in terms of bringing value for all children? And then I'm going to go in depth on each of the 7 senses, talk about its purpose and its purpose in childhood and how it aids in development of all sorts. And then talk about some play and learning features that are in actuality very much sensory features that are easy to incorporate into your existing play or learning landscape. But first, I want to start this session with probably my favorite story I've ever heard. And the story was told to me by a woman a couple years ago. And at one time in her life, she was a director for a small rural nature center in the Midwest. And that nature center was a really popular destination for elementary school. So there'd be busloads of kids coming all the time. And in this particular day, there was this busload of 5th graders, right? 10 to 11 years old. And they come piling off the bus and the staff gets them engaged in all sorts of different activities. And the director's walking through the groups of the kids looking for the teacher. And she sees the teacher off a little ways in the distance. And even from that distance, it's clear that that teacher is upset. She's crying. And the director's like, oh my God, what's going on? So she goes over to her and, oh my gosh, are you okay? Is there something I can do? Is there something wrong? And the teacher looks at her and she's like, no, there's nothing wrong. Everything's wonderful. These are tears of joy. And the teacher tells the director that just a few minutes before, one of her students, who was a boy with nonverbal autism, hadn't spoken a word in his life. He comes up to the teacher and he says, It is so beautiful here, and the air smells so good. And so you can see why the teacher was crying, right? I mean, that's just phenomenal. And I was, after, studying autism and whatnot for a long, long time at that point, I was flabbergasted when I heard the story. And I'm thinking, my design mind is thinking, what was it about that? I mean, clearly nature, yes, nature is a healer. Clearly nature had something to do with it. But what was it about that place? What was it about that experience for the doors to open in this boy and for communication to flow through, not just in a few words, but in complete sentences. And granted, I mean, keep in mind the parents hadn't heard the sound of this boy's voice yet. So it's a really dramatic story, but it points to the fact that nature-based places, especially, and in my mind, as I was studying about autism and realizing how important sensory experiences are in childhood for all children, how important sensory experiences are, and how important sensory rich environments are. And I love this quote: when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows and not the flower, because the flower or the child is already perfect. They need an environment that supports them in the best way it can to be the best humans that they are meant to be. So that brings me to environmental design, how we craft our playscapes, how we craft our learning landscapes, how we take cues from wild places. And a really interesting thing happens when a child enters a space, and it doesn't matter what type of space, whether it's a play space, a learning landscape, outdoor classroom, a streetscape, their own bedroom. There's an unspoken conversation that happens, that a child initiates and has between them and their environment. And this unspoken conversation goes something like, in their mind, in their experiences: what can you offer me, space? What experiences can you afford me? What will I learn here? How can I expand my imagination? All sorts of questions go on, this conversation that happens, and the environment responds with sensory experiences. And so, again, that conversation happens in the language of a child's senses. So that brings me to, what is nature play for the seven senses? There's so much about how we approach the environmental crafting of a space, the programs, the activities that really can enrich sensory experiences. Kids need, for their development, authentic, whole body, whole system sensory experiences in order for their bodies, their brains, their nervous system, all of those things to develop in the way they should for that child, and the communication that happens between all of those different things. So essentially, the quick answer is, we all know what nature play is. Outdoor play learning and therapeutic spaces that are green and living, of course. These spaces also emphasize natural materials and processes over manufactured. But then you add in, with the senses, you add in the layers of these spaces intentionally engage children's sensory systems, and they provide variety in those sensory experiences and a range of intensity so that all kids can get the level of stimulation that they need. And it really starts with something that we all know, especially you as teachers. Children learn through their senses. That is one of the purposes, or one of the enriching developmental activities of childhood. They learn about their world. They learn about themselves within that world through their senses. They learn how to navigate and not just survive, but to thrive through their senses. The activity of play is also very much driven by a child's sensory experiences, what they're drawn to, how they explore and discover, and what play activities lead to the next. And, it's all intertwined with learning and that sort of thing. But as I just mentioned, with the brain, the body, the nervous system, and the communication that happens, kids need real sensory experiences in order to develop themselves in the way that that individual child is meant to, in context of perhaps if they have a special need or a diversity. Um, we can't achieve that on screens, right? We'll never achieve, children will never develop the way they need to with so much screen time in their daily life. They need outdoor, nature-based, seven senses. So getting into the value of nature-based sensory play, again, I mentioned big ones, brain development. It increases their gross and fine motor skill development, increases their ability to complete more and more and more and more complex learning tasks. It encourages children to think about how to solve problems and engages, develops, grows their critical thinking skills. It also stretches their imaginations, and that imagination is one of, I think, the most powerful things that children do in play. A lot of my work is really based in imaginative environments. As teachers, you know, experiential hands-on learning leads to better retention of information. And for the early years, and for kids with neurodiversities, these sorts of environments really build language competence, communication, and social skills. It also sparks curiosity, exploration, discovery, all of those wonderful things. And it also helps because in a more nature-based environments, kids are able to, they're not as stressful as say a manufactured or a built environment. So kids are able to regulate their own emotions and their own behaviors in a more positive way. And again, if a child's in meltdown, if they're going into overstimulation, there are ways and spaces that a child can more easily self-regulate their senses in nature-based spaces. And no brainer, they're just more fun. There's more variety, more things to do. With the way childhood is trending and some of the health conditions that are out there, we know that neurodiversities, lots of special needs, but neurodiversities are on the rise. Conditions like autism, sensory processing disorders, ADHD, all of these are on the rise, and more likely, than not, you perhaps have some children with some of these conditions, and they require a different approach, a different maybe crafting of their environment. But we know, like as far as the sensory aspect goes, children with autism, for example, their sensory systems receive information, process that information very differently than neurotypical people do. Their bodies might be receiving too much information or too little, and it really, it essentially gives them a very different experience about the environment, experience within their body than neurotypical people do. And typically, in neurodiversities, there are kind of a range of sensitivities to different sensory stimuli. Some kids may be hypersensitive, meaning their bodies, their brains, their systems are receiving too much information to process. They get easily overstimulated. These are what we call the avoiders of different situations and experiences. And then on the other hand, you have hyposensitive kids who their bodies and their systems aren't getting enough information to really understand their environment the way they need to feel balanced. So these are the seekers. These are the kids that are going out and trying to get as much stimulation in the ways that they need it as possible. So it is something to keep on your radar during the session, but definitely if you have kids with neurodiversity in your care. So just jumping into the seven senses now. Some of you may know the two mystery senses I'll be hitting on in just a second, but like I say, that it's beyond the traditional five senses that we all know and love: sight, touch, taste, smell, and sound. There's two more senses that have direct ties to our environment. and how we perceive our environment and how we navigate, survive, and thrive in our environments. So the sixth one is, and I'll get into each of these senses in the following slides, but just to give you a peek, the vestibular system is our sixth sense. And that has to do with movement and gravity. So like spinning or swinging is a vestibular activity. And then our seventh is proprioception, or our proprioceptive system. And this is all about body awareness. Okay, so let's start with sight. So sight is a primary way that many of us interpret our world. We see color, shapes, patterns, textures, distance, depth. All of these things help us understand where we are within our environment, gives us cues to safety, unsafe situations, that sort of thing. But in a playscape, if you have visual interest, it captures kids' attention, draws them in. And if you have different visual features around the space, it carries children around visually. It captures their attention. They move on to the next and engage in play that way. Visual interest inspires imagination. What may be part of their fort one day might be a rocket ship the next. You never know. And with visual interest, it can really offer a lot of beauty, and it can delight kids. Whimsical, those sorts of things. And depending on the colors you choose, the patterns you choose, you can create a soothing atmosphere or an exciting, thrilling atmosphere. And then visual cues can communicate natural processes. My example is a wind spinner. Gives you a cue about the breeze. It's invisible, right? But when you add a spinner or even chimes, which move, they also have sound, it gives you cues about what's happening in the natural environment. Mirrors, messaging, all of these things are really wonderful for adding more sight. So if you have hypersensitive kids, bold colors, patterns, a lot of those things might be too much visually. So you may consider spaces. If you don't have like a wild setting, you may consider spaces that are more muted in terms of color. The image here really illustrates lots of greens and browns, and the visual interest is more in the textures, right? But if you have hyposensitive kids who really need lots of things to look at and engage with that way, wind spinners, the image here shows a sensory path. It shows colorful plantings. The little metal structure on the left there is a nature loom with colorful yarn. So lots of things to look at visually. And then in each sensory category, I'll give you a list of different features that are really good for that particular sense. And you'll see some of these features kind of carry over into other senses, which just means they're multisensory, right? But an interesting entry point that signifies I'm going into my special nature play space, or I'm leaving it and going home. Structures like forts can be landmarks. Garden art, I mentioned nature looms, I love those. Murals that the kids can create themselves and put up. Simple things like magnifying glasses, binoculars, kaleidoscopes or telescopes, stuff, things like that really kind of add to the visual quality and maybe kind of distort it a little bit to add interest. Those are all very, very effective. Colorful plantings. 2 is touch. Now our skin, our largest organ, is responsible for our tactile system. And we have touch receptors, like millions of them, all over our body. For example, we have 3,000 touch receptors in each of our fingertips. So you can imagine like how much information we're receiving at all times just through our skin. And touch, the tactile system is really essential for development in terms of physical development, cognitive communication. This system really gives us a lot of information about our environment. Some of it has to do with safety and survival. Is something super hot? Is it cold? Soft, hard, is it painful? Is it pleasant? All of these things, the textures are transmitted, the touch receptors pick up this information, transmit it through our nervous system to our brains for our brains to interpret and then make judgments. And that leads to our actions and reactions in a space. And then the tactile system also, because of the hands-on nature of nature play, it really feeds that exploration, discovery, that happens in a place, which leads to learning. And as all kids do, they do things over and over again so that they can be masters of that task, that loop, that mastery drive. So touch is really a key component of that. There are quite a few kids with neurodiversities that are hypersensitive in their tactile system. These are kids who may not like their bare feet in grass. They may not want to get their hands dirty. They don't like the feel of their hands being dirty. So having something like a sensory bin that is contained, it's kind of known, this is the space. You can add things to it depending on some of the things they may like. If little Johnny wants to, if you're going to work with him with a sensory bin and he loves Matchbox cars, you might add a handful of Matchbox cars as a kind of a gateway to exploring other tactile qualities, other materials. If you have a hyposensitive kid, they're looking for more information constantly. And so natural spaces are like perfect, right? So just in this image alone, there's wet, there's dry, there's brittle, there's slimy, there's mud, water, branches, all sorts of different things. Maybe some microfauna, some snails or something like that for them to really get a range of tactile experiences. So again, sand, water play, mud kitchens are one of my favorite things. And I'll talk about those more in just a minute. Sensory bins. I've also seen sensory bins taken a step larger and made into like kiddie pools for a hyposensitive kid, fill it with leaves, and they can like literally swim in it for a full body experience. Sensory paths. I include these in pretty much every design I do anymore. And I'm not talking about the indoor decal painted on the walls and the floors. I'm talking about an outdoor path that I'll show you here in a little bit. I'll show you some images. Tactile panels made out of natural materials that they can explore. Of course, gardening and digging right there. Lots of tactile experiences. There's sensory plantings. Let me just go up to, on the upper right is lamb's ear. It's a drought tolerant, low maintenance perennial that is ultra soft. If you've got a child who is hypersensitive, they don't really want a lot of tactile experiences, that also may be a gateway plant where it's really soft and they actually might enjoy. It's like one of those super soft t-shirts, no seams, that kids like, that kids can tolerate, I should say. Log segments used in different ways for different activities. Habitat features, do you have a few boulders set out in the landscape, kind of dug down in the ground, that will eventually be habitat for microfauna that the kids can roll around? Mother logs, things like that, very simple. Taste. Taste is tied to physical health, right? We all know that when kids are involved in growing their own food, they're more likely to eat it. Starting seeds, watching them grow, watching them develop and fruit out, the kids learn where the food comes from. And what's more fun than exploring your taste buds, right? What's a ripe strawberry taste like compared to an unripe strawberry? You can do that with all sorts of things. It also lends more to sustainability and a child's independence. I would wager that all of us on here would agree that all kids should know how to grow their own food, right? And bottom line, what is more fun than eating while you're playing? I mean, the hope is that kids would be able to graze while they play. And especially if you have picky eaters, when you insert that into the play activity, they're not being pushed to do it. It's on their own terms and they can test it out and experiment. But with taste, of course, make sure that all plants that you Introduce all the plant parts are non-toxic. You can assume that everything in your space is going to end up in their mouth at some point in time. And there's lists online about, you can Google, X plant and, toxicity for children and really find out quickly whether or not it's something you can include in your space. Hypersensitive kids, these are kids, maybe they go beyond the picky eater. But again, if the opportunity is available, and if you can do some sort of gateway vegetable, like a cherry tomato, not all kids love tomatoes, but cherry tomatoes can be more sweet. Cucumbers. So there's lots of things you can experiment with to see if you can get a hypersensitive child to try some things. Now, hyposensitive kids, they're going to want to eat all day long. They're going to want to put things in their mouth just to feel them, to learn more about them. So lots of edible gardens. One of the things that you can do, and what I often do, is I intersperse edible plants throughout the playscape in lieu of ornamentals. Just because, if they need to add more taste, then that's a fantastic way to do it. Plants like aronia, that's a superfood. Lingonberry, that's really tart, it's like a cranberry. Arctic raspberry, ground covers, lots of things. Of course, the vegetable and herbs. There's lots of edible flowers that you can include anywhere and everywhere. Nasturtium have a really peppery taste. So pansy, did you know you can eat a dahlia? So there's lots of fun things that you can craft some of your programming and activities around that has to do with eating things. Mud kitchens can be the venue for snacks. And of course, creating a shady space for eating outside and picnicking, that's so much more fun than eating inside at the table. Okay, smell. This sensory system is tied directly to our memory and our emotions in our brain. Like, for example, peonies. For me, the fragrant smell of a peony reminds me of my grandfather, who was a dairy farmer, but he grew a massive amount of peonies on his farm. So it's a really beautiful connection there. Our sense of smell also triggers us physiologically. Like if there's really a really horrible smell that makes you kind of ill, you might dry heave, or on the better flip side, if you smell like baking cookies, your mouth might water, like you're gonna want some. So our sense of smell tells us, in terms of not just food, but other things, what's pleasant, what we can eat, what might be unsafe. The smell of like burning electrical in the house, something's up, right? You want to address it. So that's our sense of smell. It keeps us safe. Nature connection, getting kids to really interact hands-on with nature. There's certain plants whose smell are stronger when you rub the leaves together in their hands and then you smell it. And then with any of the sensory system, really, the sense of smell helps build communication, vocabulary, social skills. You can ask the kids to describe to you what they're smelling like, how does it make you feel? Those sorts of things. That can actually happen with any of these sensory systems. So with hypersensitive kids, some aromas may just make them totally ill. And if you have a fragrant plant that you'd like to use, you might put it in a pot so that, if that child's outside and it's not making them feel very good, you can just, move it out of the space for the time. If you have hyposensitive kids that just want to smell everything, maybe there's a space where there's a smell garden and you can just, fill it with fragrant plants that will be fragrant at different times of the year. And then put a sign there, right? Messaging. Otherwise, kids may not know to go smell these things and have that experience. Smell, maybe a picture of a nose to really communicate in simple, clear messaging what the purpose is. And so herbs, so many different herbs to use. Annuals like chocolate cosmos, like literally smells like chocolate, and they're beautiful. So many different perennials, but these are just a handful. There's probably more than a dozen different types of scented geraniums. Lemon, rose, orange, mint, chocolate mint, so many different types of geraniums. And shrubs, And again, I'm in hardiness zone kind of 6. So again, these are a lot of materials that I use. So depending on what part of the country you're in, you'll have to tailor it to what is hardy where you are. And then things that aren't plants, water and sand play, of course, digging area, that smell of earth that I think we all just in our DNA that we're kind of wired to love. Compost areas, if they're done well, they're not supposed to smell a whole lot, but there's still some aromas. And there are some kids who like the not like the kind of odd smells, right? So it's okay to have different types of aromas in your playscape. And again, messaging. Our fifth sense, our auditory system, sound, is a really interesting one. Our brains are wired to respond to the different ingredients of sound, the pitch, the timing, and the timbre. And actually, every one of our brains processes sound just a little bit differently. And fun fact, did you know that the sense of sound is actually our fastest sense? And there was a study done by a fellow named Seth Horowitz, I believe, who's a scientist, neuroscientist, and he has found that our sense of sound is 2 to 10 times faster than our sense of sight. That's nuts, right? So what does that mean? Like, why do we care? We the sense of sound, like that information comes to us to interpret first because it's the fastest, and then all of our other sensory experiences get layered on top of that. So really, our sense of sound kind of sets the stage or colors everything that comes in after. So it colors our experience, or it shapes our experience of everything. So there's a ton of ways that already exist. That there's a ton of sensory experiences in sound that already exist in playscapes or learning landscapes. Nature sounds, social sounds, people just interacting with one another. You can add musical instruments, different ways to create the vibration or the feel of sound. So you hear it and you feel it. One thing with sound, you want to make sure that noisy active areas are separate from your more quiet, passive, cozy areas, because there's a big conflict, especially if you have children with neurodiversities. And then depending on where you are, you may, if your center is located near a noisy road, you may need to consider buffering some of that noise pollution that's coming in and affecting the sound atmosphere in your space. Hypersensitive kids, definitely back to that like quiet, passive space. They may need a space that's secluded, that they can just, there's not a lot of sound coming in. They may need to wear noise canceling headphones in order to do some of the play activities. Hyposensitive kids, they're always looking for different ways to make noise, to hear noise. And so something like this is a DIY kind of sound wall. Lots of ways, lots of ways to have children create their own sound. And I'll get to that here in a second. There's a question about buffering noise. Busy highway, very distracting. Yeah, so fencing is one way, but there's actually and I forget, if you leave me your information, Elizabeth, there's some information, there's a product that is basically kind of like, if you've ever seen like weed barrier fabric, like rolls of this black fabric, it's actually sound buffering fabric that you can install on your fence if you don't have the space to create like a hedge, an evergreen hedge, or a mixed deciduous and evergreen hedge. So I would say fencing, adding that extra product, hedges, and that sort of thing. And definitely be cognizant of where you're locating passive quiet spaces. If you have the ability, find another space for that. So I hear you, it's really challenging. So you're very welcome. All right. So more features for sound. Sensory plantings. Yes, there's so many ornamental grasses, aspen, Plants that their leaves or blades move with the wind or move when children walk through. Pods. If you've ever grown calabash or different gourds, when they're dry, you can use them literally as maracas. The seeds shake inside. The tink of bamboo, kids can run, sticks along them and get those different sounds. Social gathering spaces, different types of activities. Maybe there's a big group, small group, one-on-one, for whispering, for talking, singing. You can add talk tubes where kids are at different points in the playscape and can talk with one another. They can see each other in the distance and then are talking with one another. Musical instruments, so many different choices that you can build yourself or purchase. But I will say, if you're going to purchase, as a designer, my experience is that um, many musical instruments, for purchase, can be quite expensive. So make sure you go through if they have an audio file of what that thing sounds like, because some of them sound really good. Some of them are really obnoxious and tinny, and your neighbors are going to hate you, and the kids won't even like it, and your staff won't like it. So know what you're getting into if you're going to spend the money on something purchased like that. Pathways, it sounds different walking on gravel versus a garden path versus concrete versus a sensory path. Of course, loose parts, water play, sand play, and anything that really emphasizes natural processes like the wind or rain or anything like that, that you can, add to that soundscape. Okay, the last two fun ones, vestibular. This sensory system is located in our inner ear. If you have ever had vertigo, that is your vestibular system is really unhappy, right? You feel dizzy, you're gonna fall over, you can't stand upright. Um, this system communicates where our head is relative to motion and gravity. Am I right side up? Am I upside down? Am I sideways? Our inner ear communicates to our brain in very complex ways, our sense of ourself in space relative to gravity. So equilibrium, movement, balance, postural control, muscle tone. Bilateral coordination is being able to use both hands in the same activity. For example, holding a piece of paper and cutting it with scissors. Activities that involve crossing the midline, like climbing, where they're reaching across the midline of your body. They're reaching across like this to do climbing or games or catching a ball. That engages both sides of your brain at the same time. Really helpful activities for children to engage their vestibular systems. It's also tied to sight. Like if you've ever been on a swing, you tend to hold a steady gaze on the horizon, right? And you do the same thing with walking. So it really, vestibular system and sight really helps us navigate the world. And when you have more vestibular activities that kids can engage in, it helps them feel more safe and secure and confident in their bodies. One big example is kids who are hypersensitive to vestibular activities. They do not want to swing. For some kids, even standing up and turning around too fast is going to make them fall over. So they feel very out of control in their own bodies. And so activities like the bouncy horses, oh my God, no way, they will never do it because they don't feel in control of their own body. So things like mild versions of those activities, like walking, gently rocking, gently swinging, those are going to be really beneficial activities for kids who are getting too much of that information already. Hyposensitive kids, these are the kids who are like, you're trying to teach them a lesson. They're up, walking around, they're rocking, they're spinning, they're moving constantly. They need that information to feel good in their bodies, but they may also need that information in order to hear you and retain and process that verbal information better. So for these kids, if you've got one of these, if there's an opportunity to take one of your lessons or one of your activities out to a hammock, so that kid can get that stimulation in a non-disruptive way, that just makes it better for everyone. So again, pathways, moving through, variety of swings. little lawn berms offer all sorts of different movements, bouncy things, spinners, space for yoga. Getting, the different yoga poses, get your head in different positions, give you that vestibular stimulation. Climbing, balancing, bikes and trikes, all of these things give vestibular input. And then finally, the last one, proprioception. I'm just going to check my time real quick. This is actually, of all of the senses I'm talking about today, this is the only internal sense. It doesn't require any external environmental input in order to work properly. This is all about our internal body awareness and how our brain communicates to our muscles, our tendons, our joints, and things like this to do activities, to communicate to our bodies, to communicate to ourselves where we are in space. Like how many of us have walked through a doorway and caught our shoulder on the side? Like I do that all the time. That's a proprioceptive thing. And it also is about the use of force or pressure to do an activity. So my brain communicates to my hand, the muscles and joints and whatever, my hand, to be able to pick up a paper cup of water without creating a mini geyser, right? So all about coordination, posture, again, body awareness, self-regulation, ability to focus because they're moving, and also speech. So again, driven by movement. And this sensory system is also very tied to our tactile, our touch system. Pressure is important. You may know some kids who do really well with a weighted blanket, calms them down, or a weighted toy, calms them down, allows them to focus because they're receiving that information now that their brains can focus on the task at hand. Kids with proprioceptive issues might appear clumsy. They might fall out of their seats. When they really shouldn't. You think they shouldn't. These are also the kids out on the playground who play really rough with others and they don't realize it, because again, the force it takes to do an activity. They might tackle a little too hard or hug too hard. They might slam a cabinet door, and you're like, "My gosh, Johnny, why? You don't need to slam it like that." Well, their brains aren't processing the small amount of force it takes just to gently shut cabinet door. So again, for these kids, provide a lot of opportunities for movement, lots of variety, hypersensitive. So here's an activity that I want to kind of show the difference between what's a mild version that's appropriate for hypersensitive, and what's a more intense version for hypo. So pulling a wagon or a sled, pulling something. For a child who's hypersensitive to proprioceptive activities, pulling a light wagon might be enough for a short distance. That may be just what they need. If you've got a child who is constantly wanting to do activities, to lift heavy things, that sort of thing, get them a wagon or a sled, put one of their buddies in it, put your garden tools in it and say, "Hey, Sarah, come, take this wagon and come with me to the garden. You can haul the tools." So make it fun. So again, very similar to vestibular, very similar to tactile pathways, climbing, movement-based activities, tools that encourage a variety of movement, whether it's gross or fine motor skills. Digging, raking, gardening is amazing for this. Artwork, watering cans. All kids love to water. So maybe have a few different sizes of watering cans, that one that holds a little more water and is a little more heavy, one that's smaller and doesn't hold as much water. Maybe they just want to haul it around empty. Whatever works for that child. So I know I gave you a ton of different features and you're like, okay, I don't even know what is best. I don't know where to start. So I'm going to give you my top 5. These are multisensory. So the biggest bang for your buck and the biggest, most ranging sensory experience that we can get. So number 1 is the mud kitchen. This one hits all 7 senses. And the more you accessorize and tweak and add, you can see in this, there's a mud kitchen, but there's also a little counter table, and there's the little boy has a wheelbarrow with water in it, and there's a little girl sitting and eating or doing whatever she's doing, like a dining table. This hits all 7 senses. Two, loose parts. I will advocate for loose parts all day long. You know the theory, the more loose parts there are in a space, the more play opportunities exist. And I will also add to that, the more sensory experiences exist. And this is like, you can collect these. The loose parts can be free. Edible garden and digging space. To me, I always advocate for these two together, like peanut butter and jelly. One just complements the other. The digging is really like a really valuable thing for kids to be spending time doing, sensory speaking. But you don't want them digging in the garden space, right? So have a little digging space, put some child-sized tools, buckets and those, a wheelbarrow, a sign that says dig here, so it communicates the intent of the space, and you've got a really magical sensory space. Now, this is a sensory path. I've included these in pretty much every design I've done in the last, 3-4 years. And so sensory paths, and they don't have to be this elaborate. They can be very simple, very short, but they're paths made out of a variety of natural materials or manufactured. There's some pavers in these. But it gives children different experience in moving through the space. And you can, as you can see, and imagine that they are also multisensory. They're visual, they've got a ton of texture, there's shapes, proprioception and vestibular. So proprioception, it's more difficult to walk on one of these paths than it is a concrete path. They are not ADA accessible, but dang it, do kids love them. I did one for a nature center here locally as part of the school. And the director was like, the sensory path is the best thing that we've added because kids move differently through the space. They don't just run or walk down the path. They skip, they hop, they slow down and actually watch what they're walking on. So it was really fascinating to her how it kind of changed kids' behavior. And then the last one, I hadn't really talked about this, but this one is really essential. Cozy spaces. Actually, I kind of alluded to it in sound. So cozy spaces are child-sized nooks that give a sense of refuge. It's a child has now their own space that they can go to. They have a feeling of seclusion, of getting away from a situation that they feel is overwhelming. Cozy spaces can be anything from something that's constructed like a fort or the little beehive image you see on the right, to something, very inexpensive like the garden, the bean pole teepee, to something on the left that a child can create for themselves. And really, these are essential for all kids, but especially important for kids with neurodiversities because it offers a refuge, a safe haven, if they are in overwhelm, if they're on the verge of a meltdown and they need to go to a space to self-regulate, to calm down, to get back toward sensory balance. So quickly, in summary, I'm just kind of hitting those highlights. It's really important to look through at your playscape, at any playscape or children's space, through the lens of sensory experiences, those 7 senses. Because we know children experience the world, they learn about the world and themselves through their sensory systems. Nature play for the 7 senses is really critical in building the body, the brain, the nervous system of all kids so that they can develop into the best of versions, the best humans that they were meant to be. And really, we need to look at providing the variety and range of intensity of sensory experiences so that all kids can get the level and type of sensory experience that is meaningful for them at the time. So I think that wraps up. So again, I've been doing sensory work for about 17 years. I've got stacks of references. All of my information I gave you is evidence-based, but these are kind of the highlights, information that I thought you might find most interesting. Beyond this, if you want more information, don't hesitate to contact me. I'm more than happy to share all my sources. And I just wanted to thank you for your time and being here. I hope you got some good information and ideas for your own space. This is my contact information, my website. You can connect with me on Facebook. I've just started that up. I'm going to be putting a lot of information, DIY videos on simple structures that you can add easily and on the cheap that are really effective for the kiddos that are in your care. So again, thank you. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I think we've got some time left for questions. Thank you, ladies. Thank you for the compliments. I love this work, and I love talking about this work. And I always love working with folks in the educational realms.
Everyone should have the ability to unmute themselves, but if not, feel free to just make a note in the chat and I can unmute you as well.
And if anyone wants my presentation PDFs, Drew just told me how I can share that on the Natural Start Alliance site, so that if you have any, if you want to reference it at any other time. All right, I will do that, Jennifer.
I have a question.
Hi there. How you doing?
Good. So with having a classroom with children who have different neurodiversities and abilities, what do you do when you have one child that either, well, it needs something a little bit differently, and then the other children see that child has something different and they want to do it, but it might be more distracting for them?
You know, it's a balance, right? I think without knowing more about the specific need, you never want to point out a difference in a negative way, right? Because kids are going to figure that out anyway. So if there's an opportunity for it to be like a game or something that all kids can be involved in, takes turns, I would consider, if you can, working that into some of the activities you have planned or some of the programs that you have, so that it's not just the one child receiving that whatever that stimulation is, that they're the activity that they're doing. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, when you're the only teacher or an adult in a group of children, again, if it becomes a situation, you may need to pause what it is that you're doing and address that, and maybe it's just a break in the activity that you were doing to give these children this experience, and then you can go back to it. Right. So, we as the adults have to maybe do a little bit more modification or be a little bit more flexible than we had originally planned. But the child who needs that experience needs it for a reason. They're not doing it to be obnoxious or to distract you or to distract the others. They're doing it because they have a physical neurological need for that. So that's what I mean. That's not a really straightforward answer, but I would say be flexible, and if you can work it into whatever it is you're doing, that will help.
Thank you.
Sure. I work at a zoo. Question come in. I work at a zoo, and we have a huge age range of kids using our play spaces. How do you address making nature play spaces that work for a wide age? So nature play spaces that work for a wide age range. So yes, everything that I talked about is appropriate for many ages. I've even done sensory environments for middle school age kids and have used the concept of a cozy space, have used different pathways. It even has a sensory path. So there's a lot of things that can translate to the older ages. Now, if you've got so elementary school, absolutely, this presentation fully applies. You might tweak a few things here and there, maybe some of the programming and types of activities that are done. But even for kind of if you're working with the older, like the tweens or the teens, you might kind of craft some spaces into more social spaces. They don't want to perhaps do some of the things that the younger kids are doing. They want to go hang out, and maybe they'll wander a sensory path, and maybe there's kind of a cluster of boulders to sit and socialize with their cousin or whoever they're there with. So it leans towards the social dynamic when you get into the older years. So it's just, being able to modify some of these things. Do you have, oh, coming in fast. Hang on, let me scroll up here. one or two. Okay, Lynn. Okay, Lynn, I'm gonna get to your question. Do you have one or two resources that are good places to start for developing these spaces? That's what I'm doing. I'm actually almost done with an ebook right now for being able to develop these spaces. I'm gearing it towards home, but it absolutely applies to like a school setting. There's the Natural Learning Initiative, which is a fantastic resource. They're in North Carolina. They've got a great website, lots of ideas. So I would say they would be another great choice. Is there a group or person you follow online for continued inspiration and info? Quite honestly, I get my inspiration from other professionals that don't do what I do. So I've learned probably the two types of professionals I get the most inspiration from are educators and occupational therapists. So I talk with them a lot. I talk with different folks in those two realms a lot. And of course, artists. I'm always wanting to know like earth art and that sort of thing to how can we bring more art into these spaces? So that's and that's a general answer to your question. I apologize about that. Okay, Kendra, additionally, we're a city facility with lots of restrictions around making changes to play spaces. Any recommendation for how to build some of these with those restrictions? Okay, so who asked that? Kendra, are you talking about like the playground safety guidelines? Because right now, those don't address nature play areas. However, anything that you do design should give a nod or acknowledge the safety requirements, like for climbing, for fall zone, that sort of thing. So I would recommend getting familiar with the Public Playground Safety Handbook. Again, it doesn't address nature play, but it'll give you some good information about how you can craft like a natural climbing structure, embankment slides, those sorts of things. And at grade play, things like cozy spaces, mud kitchens, those aren't intended to be like the mud kitchen, that's not intended to be climbed on. So it really doesn't apply to those particular safety restrictions. Let's see here. Social media. So I'm on Facebook pretty much only right now. And as for nature play, you can search and find it pretty immediately. Let's see, I'm just scrolling through here. These ladies, and guys, if there's any guys, these are awesome questions. And if I didn't answer, especially regarding the restrictions, if I didn't answer that adequately, please reach out to me because I'd love to give you a more full answer. And if you want to jump on a call, I can give you, I'd have a conversation with you. I think that was it. I think I answered every question. All right. 10:29, 1 minute. 1 minute to spare.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jenna. If you do have additional questions, you can reach out to her like she said, and then we will get the presentation posted on the Natural Start Conference website sometime later. Just give us a little bit of time here to get situated as we work through the rest of the sessions here, but thank you all for joining, and hopefully we will see you in another session soon. Thanks.
Thanks so much for being here.